Millrose, a small farming community within Oakridge County, sat on a long, narrow strip of land between two rivers, and for as long as anyone could remember, that strip of land had grown some of the best peaches in the whole Midwest. Sadie Coleman had married into peach country 30 years before, and by the spring of 1992, she was working the orchard alone for the first time in her life. Her husband, Ray, had passed that winter, quietly, in his sleep, the way some men do after a lifetime of hard mornings. The orchard was 40 acres of peach trees on a south-facing slope above the river bottom. Trees Ray's own father had planted, and trees Ray had tended every spring of his life until the last one. Sadie stood among them on a cold, damp morning in early April, watching the blossoms just beginning to open, pink and fragile against a gray sky. And she was doing the thing every peach grower in the county was doing that week, worrying about frost and worrying about bees. Her brother-in-law, Frank Coleman, Ray's older brother, pulled his truck up the lane that same morning, climbed out, and walked the rows beside her without much patience for small talk. Frank ran a much larger operation 2 farms over, modern by local standards, and he'd never been shy about his opinion that a widow alone couldn't keep 40 acres of peaches going, not without help, not without money she didn't have. He told her plainly that the smart growers, himself included, had already paid to bring in rented honeybee hives from a commercial beekeeper down near Delwood, the county seat, trucked and fresh for bloom season, guaranteed pollination no matter what the weather did. He said she ought to do the same, or else lease the ground to someone who would, before another cold, wet spring cost her the whole crop. Sadie told him she'd think about it, though she already suspected she couldn't afford what he was suggesting, not this year, maybe not any year. That evening, going through a box of Ray's mother's old things in the attic, things nobody had touched in years, Sadie found a cloth-bound notebook, its pages soft and yellowed, filled with handwriting she recognized as her late mother-in-law's. The notebook wasn't fancy. It was mostly weather notes, bloom dates, and small sketches of the orchard's edges. But one page, dated from a cold spring decades earlier, caught her eye. It described a spring almost exactly like the one she was facing now, cold and wet through bloom time, when the honeybees a neighbor had rented stayed clustered inside their hives day after day, too chilled to fly, while the peach trees along the orchard's old fence line, the ones growing thick with wild plum and dogwood and serviceberry, still managed to set a decent crop that year. The notebook credited it plainly to the wild bees that lived in that same hedgerow, small dark bees nesting in old wood and hollow stems, working the blossoms in weather that kept the rented honeybees shut inside. Sadie sat with that notebook a long while that night, reading the page over twice. She remembered, now that she thought of it, that hedgerow herself, a ragged line of brush and small trees along the orchard's eastern boundary that Ray had let grow wild for years, mostly because he never had time to clear it, and that Frank had more than once called an eyesore worth bulldozing. The next morning, she walked out to that hedgerow before the frost had even burned off the grass. She found wild plum in early bloom, a scattering of small dark bees already moving low and steady among the blossoms despite the cold, bees no bigger than a housefly, working in weather that had kept every honeybee she could see clustered tight inside a neighbor's rented hives down the road. She watched them for the better part of an hour, crouched at the edge of the brush with her coffee going cold in her hand, simply paying attention the way her mother-in-law apparently once had. These, she realized, were mason bees, solitary little natives that didn't live in hives at all, that nested alone in old wood and hollow reeds, and that were known, she remembered reading somewhere years before, for flying and working blossoms in weather far too cold and damp for honeybees to bother leaving home. She drove into town that same afternoon and asked at the farm supply store about them, and the older clerk there, who'd heard of the practice from his own father, told her some growers used to drill small holes into blocks of scrap wood or bundle hollow stems together and hang them near the orchard edge each spring to give those wild bees a place to nest close to the blossoms that needed them most. It cost her almost nothing. A few afternoons with a drill and some scrap cedar from the barn, a bundle of hollow stems cut from last year's dead sunflower stalks, hung in bundles along fence posts near that same wild hedgerow. Her daughter, Ellen, 17 and home for spring break from school, thought the whole thing sounded a little strange at first and said as much, but came out to help anyway. Mostly, she admitted, out of curiosity. Together they drilled 24 blocks and hung them at intervals through the orchard's eastern rows, closest to the old hedgerow, then did the same, lighter, through the rest of the orchard where there was no brush line at all, just to see what difference the hedgerow itself might make. Frank came by again a few days later, saw the wooden blocks hanging from the fence posts, and didn't bother hiding his opinion. He said plainly that drilled-up scrap wood wasn't going to replace a truckload of paid honeybees, that she was wasting good time on something that sounded more like a craft project than a pollination plan, and that he still thought she ought to lease the ground to someone with the money to do this properly. Sadie told him she appreciated his concern, but that she intended to watch the season through before deciding anything about the ground her husband and his father had spent their whole lives tending. What followed over the next 2 weeks was mostly quiet, careful watching, the same kind her mother-in-law must have done decades before her. Ellen kept a simple record each morning, walking the rows near the hedgerow first, then the open rows farther out, noting how many blossoms she saw actual bees actively working, not just present, but moving, feeding, doing their job. On the cold, overcast mornings, the kind that made up most of that April, the honeybees Frank had paid for 2 farms overstayed shut inside their hives entirely, and even Sadie's own open rows, the ones without hedgerow nearby, sat mostly quiet and still. But near the wooden nesting blocks and the wild hedgerow, the small dark mason bees kept working steadily, blossom to blossom, even with a light drizzle falling and the temperature holding stubbornly in the 40s. Ellen counted the difference plainly in her notebook. More active bees near the hedgerow on cold mornings than anywhere else on the whole property, some mornings by a wide margin. Sadie began moving a few more nesting blocks farther out into the open rows as the weeks went on, spacing them so the little bees, which didn't range far from home the way honeybees do, could reach blossoms even away from the hedgerow itself. By early May, with bloom mostly finished and the first small green peaches beginning to swell on the branches, the difference across the orchard was plain enough that even Ellen, who'd been skeptical at the start herself, stopped needing to consult her notebook to see it. The rows nearest the hedgerow and the nesting blocks were setting fruit heavily, clusters of small peaches crowding the branches. The far rows, planted with nesting blocks only in the last couple of weeks of bloom, showed a lighter but still noticeably improved set compared to what Sadie remembered from cold, wet springs in years past. Word travels quickly in a county that small, and it wasn't long before Frank drove up the lane again, this time walking the rows himself without much to say at first, running a hand along a branch heavy with young fruit near the old hedgerow. He admitted, after a long quiet minute, that his own orchard, the one with the rented honeybees he'd paid good money for, had come through that same cold spring with a noticeably lighter set than he'd hoped, since the bees he'd trucked in had simply stayed inside through most of the worst weather, same as always, same as every wet spring he could remember, if he was honest about it. He didn't apologize outright. That wasn't really his way. But he stood there a while longer than he needed to, looking at trees his own brother had once tended, now clearly thriving under his widow's care. Before he left that day, he asked, almost reluctantly, whether she might show him how to build a few of those blocks himself, for his own place, next spring. Sadie told him she'd be glad to, and that there was room enough in that old hedgerow of ideas for more than one Coleman orchard to benefit from it. That evening, sitting on the porch with Ellen as the light faded gold over the river bottom, Sadie handed her daughter the old cloth-bound notebook, the one that had started the whole thing. She told her it belonged to her grandmother now, if she wanted it, along with whatever new pages the two of them had already started adding that spring. Ellen took it carefully, flipping through her own recent notes already tucked inside the back cover, and said she thought she'd keep adding to it, so that whoever ran this ground next, whether that was her or someone not yet born, wouldn't have to relearn the same lesson from scratch. Sadie didn't say much back, just nodded, and looked out over the orchard, the hedgerow at its eastern edge no longer an eyesore to anyone, its wild plum and dogwood blossoms mostly faded now, small peaches swelling steadily in the rows all around it. Nobody in Millrose ever called what happened on the Coleman place a miracle, and Sadie herself would have been the first to say it wasn't one. It was an old, overgrown fence line nobody had bothered to clear, a box of nesting blocks that cost less than a single afternoon's work, and a woman willing to watch her own ground closely enough to notice what was already quietly working there, long before anyone thought to pay attention to it. The practice at the heart of this story, maintaining hedgerows of native flowering shrubs and providing simple nesting sites for solitary bees such as mason bees, reflects a real and scientifically recognized approach to orchard pollination. Native solitary bees are generally more cold-tolerant and willing to forage in cooler, damper conditions than honeybees, making them valuable, reliable pollinators during the unpredictable weather common during fruit tree bloom in much of the American Midwest. Providing nesting materials, such as drilled wood blocks or bundles of hollow plant stems, alongside hedgerows offering early-season pollen and nectar sources, remains a documented and effective method for supporting these pollinators, one that many small orchards relied on for generations before commercial pollination services became widely available.